BYU's upset of Arizona was undoubtedly the win of the season to date, but the nice part is there is even more for BYU basketball to chase in the final four games of the regular season.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day, and more importantly, thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Hit up FanDuel.com or get their app to get started today. Coming up on today's show, we're going to talk a little BYU basketball and what they have still to accomplish in the aftermath of a pretty incredible week. We'll also talk about BYU's growing prowess, I guess I'll say, when it comes to NIL. And then we'll finish up today's show by talking a little bit about BYU's wide receivers going into spring camp, which begins this week for the BYU football program. So let's start off today's show talking a little BYU basketball. 96-95 upset of then number 19 Arizona. I am expecting by the time many of you might listen and or hear this podcast or watch it on YouTube, BYU could find themselves nationally ranked. I do think they should be inside the national rankings. We'll see where they ultimately end up. I would guess somewhere in the 20 to 25 range, but we'll see what happens there. The more important thing is BYU can, in some ways, rest on its laurels. They have now been entered into the lock territory with regards to making the NCAA tournament. They're in solo fifth place in the Big 12 conference currently at a 10-6 record. They've got a showdown in about a week and a half against Iowa State that could be for the fourth seed in a double bye in the Big 12 tournament. So there is a lot still for BYU basketball to accomplish in their final four regular season games. Arizona State coming up on Wednesday night is the next test for BYU, and Arizona State's going through it. BJ Freeman, their leading scorer, was kicked off the team over this past weekend. They lost one of their big men who left their game over the weekend on crutches. So Arizona State's going through it. So BYU, in theory, should win that game against ASU and then should roll into a home date against West Virginia on Saturday night thinking, all right, handle this. We handle our business against Utah. Those are 3 wins that should allow BYU at worst to sit in the 5th spot with a bye in the first round of the Big 12 tournament. And it really comes down to, if you can win on the road at Iowa State, BYU could be one of the top 4 teams going into the Big 12 tournament and once again have that double bye. We have talked a lot, and I haven't mentioned as much recently, that BYU basketball, the last time they won a conference title tournament, a conference tournament title, excuse my dyslexia there, but the last time they did that was 2001, back in the early days of the Mountain West Conference. Steve Cleveland led the way. McKelly Wesley, that group was the last BYU basketball team to win a conference tournament title. If you want to see BYU snap that streak 24 years later, having a double bye in the Big 12 tournament would go a long way to helping BYU do just that. Now, you'd have to fend off some pretty fierce competition. You got the likes of Houston out there, a rematch against Arizona, potentially a rematch against the likes of Iowa State. All of those are going to be ferocious, tough matchups in Kansas City. But this BYU basketball team has proven itself to be worthy and capable of beating those teams. You don't go to Arizona to the McHale Center and put up 96 points without being a very, very good basketball team. It is incredible to consider what BYU has done in the past week alone. Back-to-back top 25 upsets, one of which against Kansas, that 34-point pasting, was one of the worst losses in Kansas basketball history, and they've got an illustrious history, speaking of the Jayhawks. And then you back that up by going once again to the McHale Center and beating Arizona, who at the time was top 10 in a lot of the metrics out there when it came to offense and defense, and you take care of business. And spare me that it was a foul. It wasn't a foul. It's a hip check. By definition, a foul is a foul no matter when it comes in the game. And let's also acknowledge that that game was full of some pretty erroneous foul calls. The other thing about that game, highly, highly entertaining basketball. That's what I'm enjoying most about this BYU basketball team. I probably should use as an aside here, is this is a BYU basketball team that's not a team that you don't want to watch. They play aesthetically pleasing college basketball. And I know that the NBA and college, there's a dichotomy there of which you prefer to watch. I still, in many respects, prefer the NBA type look to the way I enjoy watching basketball. But the way BYU's playing and its NBA-esque style, it's very fun to watch. It is entertaining basketball. It's not one of these teams. Remember, like the Virginia teams of a couple years ago under Tony Bennett, where they'd win games 48-46 and be like, yeah, spare me that crap. I love when teams are scoring in the 80s and 90s and hoisting up threes, running the fast break. That's what I enjoy watching. That's what BYU's putting on the court right now. And the nice part is, even though it's aesthetically pleasing to watch, it's also winning basketball. That's the fun part. That's the combo you want to see. You want to see wins, but also you want to see a BYU basketball team that is fun to watch. And I think that's what we're getting right now. So everything is still there for BYU. If they can make a run going 4-0 down the stretch here, I said it on our postcast after the game on Saturday night. It was actually early Sunday morning when I finally sat down and recorded it. I said that I thought the ceiling for BYU right now was a 6 seed. I think that a 5 seed probably is like dream scenario. But if you want to get into that 6-7 seed range, you got to go 3-1 at worst down the stretch here, and more than likely that you probably have to go 4-0, including what would be a major upset once again out in Ames against Iowa State. So, long story short, TLDR for those of you who are checking out the podcast for the first time, BYU basketball, they're playing a really, really fun brand of basketball. Robbie McCombs broke it down in a Vanquish the Foe article and mentioned the fact that the Torvik ratings, which is one of the 7 ratings that the NCAA selection committee does, since BYU started this 4-game win streak against West Virginia, they are the number 3 team behind Duke and Clemson, who are 2 of the other hottest teams in the country. What we're watching from BYU is quite literally one of the best and brightest teams in college basketball right now, and we'll see how much further they can take it. But there is still a lot out there on the table for BYU, and I'm hoping that they stay hungry and chase every single win they can, and they go 4-0. We could be talking about a team that matches last year's team in terms of like getting a 6 seed. And heck, if you make a run in the Big 12 title game, you push them for a 5 seed. There is a lot of good high-level options for BYU to chase in these remaining weeks of the regular season and obviously early on into the postseason. But get ready. Should be a really, really fun lead up to the Big 12 tournament title and, more importantly, March Madness next month. All right, coming up here in just a minute, we're going to flip over and talk some BYU football, but also extends to BYU basketball. BYU's work in the NIL sphere, which is helping them obviously on the recruiting front, more importantly than anything else, it's starting to get some pretty interesting acclaim nationally, and we'll break that all down next right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. Now, March basketball is nearly here, and my friends, there's no better way to get in on the action than with our friends at Prize Picks, as they are the best place for daily fantasy sports. Prize Picks, all you do is simply pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash you invest. It's fast, it's easy, and it keeps every game exciting as you're watching it. The best part is it's quick and easy. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds and stay engaged all game long as you track those over-under numbers. The best part is fast payouts. When you win, your money hits your account as little as 15 minutes. No waiting around thinking, okay, when is this money going to finally get into my account? And the best part is they offer deals weekly like Taco Tuesday. We can get discounted player projections for even more value, so you can take advantage of all that at all times. So download the Prize Picks app today and use the promo code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's promo code LOCKEDONCollege for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup with our friends over at Prize Picks, where they like to say you can run your game. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Hope you all are doing well on this Monday. Had a fantastic weekend. We all know that BYU basketball enjoyed it very highly. But the bigger picture is that BYU is really starting to get some interesting, I don't want to say notoriety because it's kind of negative connotation. Some acclaim is probably the best term about this when it comes to their work in the NIL sphere. Now, a lot of this stems originally, remember, from the recruitment and ultimately the commitment and signing of AJ DeBonsa. When he signed with BYU, there were so many people saying, wow, BYU, what are they doing? They're injecting themselves into the national conversation. And I, for one, was like, yes, thank goodness they are. The biggest thing for BYU is they have got a collection of boosters, and it's deep. I couldn't even begin to guess how many of these deep-pocketed boosters BYU's got, but they are very willing to invest in BYU sports, most importantly, BYU football and BYU basketball. As I mentioned, the DeBonsa signing obviously garnered headlines. That number that BYU reportedly is paying him to come and play next year has ranged from $4 million to $7 million. Now, the latest reports from Myron Medcalf of ESPN was $8.5 million. No matter what, it's money well invested, because what a guy like AJ DeBonsa is going to bring to BYU with his just acclaim that he's getting for he's a Nike athlete. They've got legitimate ads on Nike's app and Nike.com for AJ DeBonsa. He's going to have his own signature line, a signature shoe before too long. All of that is out there for him. And that type of fame and the eyeballs it's going to draw to BYU, yeah, it's going to pay back in spades what BYU's paying to get him on campus. But the bigger point to be made here is it's extending over to BYU football as well. I talked, this goes back, it's about a week ago. We talked about the recruitment of Ryder Lyons. Now, many of you know Ryder Lyons, Folsom High School stud quarterback, a 5-star prospect, the number 2 quarterback in the 2026 recruiting cycle. BYU is one of his finalists, but we're talking some of the biggest of the big schools out there want this kid to sign with them, and BYU's right there in the mix with him. 24/7 Sports put out another article, has a very interesting note on this. That's what prompted me to talk about this, and it says that Lions, it seems to be in no rush, is adding some official visits this offseason. It says USC has been trending on the crystal ball and is outright leader for a while, but things get interesting on that front very soon. More on that shortly. Lions is looking at Oregon. Dan Lanning and his staff would love to secure Lions' commitment, especially with the fact that he'll take a mission trip. It's just a mission, let's be very clear, for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and be a part of the 2027 class. I also say keep an eye on Ohio State, Michigan, and Ole Miss as well. They are potential destinations for Lions official visits. The dark horse, though, BYU. And I say this, the Cougars have done an excellent job of recruiting him, and in the NIL era, they're doing a very good job of taking care of their top priorities. Don't sleep on Kalani Sitake and his staff. Folks, the fun part is BYU is in the fight here. I have it down to, if I were to ask me, okay, who are the leaders for a guy like Ryder Lyons? I say it's a 3-horse race right now between USC, Oregon, and BYU. Those 3 are leading the race right now, and they are the 3 that Ryder Lyons has publicly acknowledged that he will officially visit at some point. He is a guy that is a transformational type quarterback. Yes, he is mission bound. He's saying he's going on a 1-year mission. His brother spent about 14 months in Norway. Speaking of Walker Lyons, who is now at USC, he was a 4-star tight end prospect out of Folsom. BYU was in the mix for him as well, but ultimately opted to go to USC, and that's why the Trojans have long been thought to be the favorites for Ryder. But the nice part is BYU is shooting their shot. They are absolutely in the hunt here. And they mentioned Ohio State. They mentioned a program like a Michigan or an Ole Miss. They're on the outside looking in right now. I think it's a 3-horse race for Ryder Lyons. And as they mentioned here, and in the NIL era, they, speaking of Brigham Young University, are doing a very good job of taking care of their top priorities. You know who a top priority in the 2026 class, maybe the top priority in the 2026 recruiting cycle? Yeah, it's that guy right there, Ryder Lyons. He is the type of quarterback that could be the crown jewel for BYU's 2026 recruiting class, which has got a lot of good talent in it, and more importantly, has a lot of good options for BYU to add in the upcoming months leading up to the early signing window this December, and obviously early on into next year when National Signing Day comes around. But if you can get a guy like Ryder Lyons on board, you're going to have other top shelf, top flight talent that is going to say, hey, if he's picking BYU, I may want to give a second look to the Cougars. And it comes down to NIL. And there's a lot of fan bases out there. There's one 40 miles north of here that likes to say you can buy anything with money when it comes to BYU. You know what? That's just jealousy speaking, because BYU has got a booster group, and more importantly, a collective. Speaking of the Royal Blue Collective, shout out to Mark Comer and the folks over at the Royal Blue. They have been doing yeoman's work to get BYU competitive on a national stage, and it's paying off. When writers put this into stories, like this for 24/7 Sports. I think this one was by Tom Loy, who's one of their lead recruiting analysts. It doesn't come from nowhere. They know what BYU is capable of with NIL. And now that NIL is, to use that term we talk about, above board, for years there were the stories of bagmen in the SEC and all the money that they could offer to these prospects, and it was seedy, and it was just kind of unsightly. It was dirty. BYU was not about to get into the mud, and I know that some of you out there would have liked to have seen them done that. But now the NIL is allowing you to get in the race for any prospect and offer up whatever amount of money they're interested in, and it allows BYU to get in the mix on the recruiting front here. Yeah, it is going to make them a force. We're seeing guys like Malachi Lee, the number one prospect out of Hawaii. He's got BYU among his final six. Ely, I forget what his last name is, out of Orange Lutheran High School down there in Southern California. He has got blue blood after blue blood in his final seven, but one of those seven, Brigham Young University. BYU's ability to really impact the recruitment of these athletes, most notably Ryder Lyons, when it comes to NIL, it's an absolute game changer. And I, for one, I'm all on board with BYU trying and getting the best athletes they can on campus. We saw them break through with a really masterful 11-2 season this past year with a roster chock full of mainly 3-star athletes. What could BYU do as they start to sprinkle in some 4, and in the case of Ryder Lyons, 5-star athletes? Sure seems like the proverbial moon is the ceiling. What am I trying to say? It was the Michael Jordan. The roof is the ceiling. That's what I'm trying to use. And everything's there for BYU. Much like the BYU basketball program, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and everything to play for, was everything for BYU to chase when it comes to the NIL sphere. And they're getting noticed nationally, and it's fun to watch because it's causing some consternation from some other top shelf programs. And BYU could find themselves breaking into that top flight if all goes well. And it will come down to essentially BYU remaining very competitive on the NIL front. All right, we'll finish up today's show. Coming up next, we'll talk a little bit about BYU spring camp. We start this Thursday. Speaking of BYU spring ball, the 27th, there is a position group that has got some bona fide studs leading it. Speaking of BYU's wide receivers, those guys don't really need to do much in spring ball. So who does coming up in spring camp for the BYU football program? We're delving into that next as we wrap up this edition of Locked On Cougars momentarily. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with our friends at FanDuel. They are America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. If you missed the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on all that action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can combine all your live bets into a same-game parlay to obviously increase your odds, but more importantly, your payout if you break through. All of us love to use FanDuel because it's got a really simple, easy-to-use interface on their app. The best part is whether you're backing your team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, you never feel like you missed out on an opportunity. Plus, you can just get paid out instantly. That's the best part about this. You're not waiting around trying to get your money. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet hits. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today or get on their app. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets, all courtesy of FanDuel. As always, make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. If you have not done so already, what are you waiting for? Join the Locked On Cougars Insider Group today and get the inside scoop on all things BYU that I'm hearing coming to your phone in the form of a text message. Just $5 a month to join the Insiders Group, and more importantly, you get 2 full weeks of a free trial when you sign up today to see if it's the right option for you. So join us. The link is in the show notes. Whether you're watching this or listening to it, or reach out to me on social media, we'll get you taken care of. But join the Locked On Cougars Insider Group today. All right, before we go on today's show, spring camp starts this week. And the big question mark around BYU's wide receiver group is who's going to step up? And what do I mean by that? Well, Chase Roberts injured his shoulder in that bowl win, and he is more than likely going to miss spring camp. Even if he were healthy, I would venture a guess that Chase would have taken very little live action reps because you just don't want to risk him in spring camp. The other side of it is Darius Lassiter's status still remains murky. Now, on Cougar Sports Saturday with Mitch Harper and Matt Biomonte on KSL News Radio, Fesi Satake joined them this past Saturday and said, essentially, and kind of alluded to the fact that BYU is not going to have Darius Lassiter. I have been telling our insiders group for some time there's been doubt about Darius's status with regards to that JUCO waiver. Now, Darius was a guy who had to petition to get last year back alone, had to sit out the first game of the year, as many of you might recall. And it sure looks like at this point, I wouldn't be betting, much like apparently Fessi's not betting, that Darius will be part of BYU football in 2025. So without your top two guys from this past season, what does the wide receiver core got to show in spring camp? Well, I want to see who's going to step up. Is it a JoJo Phillips? Is it Cody Hagan ready to break out after suffering an injury late in the season? Can he finally get back on the field? Could a guy like Parker Kingston take his absolutely incredible return skills, but become a more well-rounded wide receiver and find himself with extra reps in that wide receiver core? Could a guy like Tei Nakua break out? There is a lot of talent in that wide receiving core, and Fesi Satake has absolutely done an incredible job bringing in talent, but more importantly, keeping that talent in the program. Referencing back to that interview that he did with Cougar Sports Saturday, he talked about what guys like JoJo Phillips have meant to this program. He said they have bought into the vision we have in this program. Too many guys are way too quick to hit the transfer portal when they feel like, hey, I'm not going to have a chance to play early on in my career. And they hit the transfer portal and you say, okay, well, thanks for coming, but they don't really build much of a rapport with anybody and they're off to their next adventure. The nice part is you could look at BYU's roster of wide receivers. Now you lose Cody Epps, you lose Darius Lassiter most likely, but then Keelan Marion, an All-American returner, much like Parker Kingston. Can Keelan step into a more prominent role this spring? Can he make himself maybe that de facto number 2 behind Chase Roberts? I've already talked about JoJo Phillips. He's got the size, 6'5", 205 pounds that you want. Prototypical size, got very good speed. Can he emerge and make that position his own opposite Chase Roberts? But I can go down this list and make an argument for every one of these guys to have an opportunity in spring camp to really show out. Dominique McKenzie, true burner with his speed. Can he finally have shown that, hey, the mission rust, it's gone, and he's capable of contributing at a high level? There is every ability and every type of skill set you want in this wide receiver room. I'm curious to see how BYU approaches spring camp with this group and who ultimately emerges in spring. As a media core, I'm expecting that we'll have maybe observation once, maybe twice a week for 15 to 20 minutes. So we'll get a snapshot look at what to expect from BYU's wide receiver core, but more importantly, the overall roster. But I look at this and say, hey, there is a lot for all of these guys on this roster to show. Even a guy like Chase Roberts, even though he's likely to be on the shelf playing more of a coaching role, well, I've had enough players tell me that when you kind of morph into that coaching role where you're coaching up the younger players and trying to kind of share your insight, what you've learned, some tricks of the trade, as it were, to help these young players be better football players, you become a better player because you kind of understand things at a deeper level. Connor Pay, our good friend here on the podcast, I do need to get him back on the show here soon to catch up with him and talk about his progress via his NFL training. But he talked when he sat out for 5 weeks this past season, how he became a much better player just mentally. He understood concepts and understood what the overall scheme of BYU's offense were than at any point, maybe during the time he'd been playing for BYU and I don't know, he'd make 50 career starts, whatever he made at BYU. It forces your mind to change and you understand things at a deeper level. And that is the opportunity that Chase Roberts has in spring camp here to really start to understand what he's doing and what he's doing as a leader for this BYU wide receiver core. But then the other guys, they're actually on the field. They have to go out and ball out. They have to obviously build a rapport with Jake Retzloff, understand what he likes as a quarterback, where he likes to put the ball, when it comes to scramble situations, where he wants you to be, finding holes in the zone, that type of stuff. All of that is important to establish in spring ball. And even with the backup quarterback, speaking of McKay Hillstead and Trayson Bourget, most notably, they have to go out there and show that they can catch passes no matter where they're thrown, when they're thrown, and prove to be a reliable option. That's the number one thing that quarterbacks most notably want, is they want proven guys who can go out and no matter what the down and distance, no matter what the time on the clock is, the pressure-packed moments or the blowouts where it's really kind of loosey-goosey, They want guys who can lock in and make plays. And that's what this younger core of wide receivers for BYU, they have to go out and show that. I'm excited because, like I said, Fesi Satake, he has stacked a lot of talent in his position group, and there's every type of skill set. You got burners, you got big-bodied guys, you got pseudo tight ends who can really post up, you got guys who can jump out of the gym like a JoJo Phillips on jump ball situations. You've got everything you could want as a wide receiver coach, and that extends to BYU offensive coordinator Aaron Roderick. He's got to be looking at this saying, I've got this whole group of toys, to use that expression, about these wide receivers. Let's see how many different facets we can use them in. And this is the time to do trial and error. If you want to try a new scheme in practice, spring camp is when you do that. When it comes to the fall training camp leading into the actual season, you have to have already buckled down on, okay, here's what our core concepts are. Here's what our core schemes are. But if you probably notice something, a wrinkle you'd like to add, well, you try it out in spring camp. If it sticks, guess what? It becomes part of the playbook. If it doesn't, you wad it up, toss it in the trash, and say, hey, we tried it. And that's what I'm looking for from this wide receiver core is who of these guys can adapt best in these circumstances that BYU's coaches will undoubtedly put them in, down in distance, like you have to go the length of the field for a game-winning field goal. Who's going to come up with critical catches? Who will get themselves open against the zone? Who is the best against man press cover that we will inevitably see coming from Gennaro Guilford and Jay Hill's defense? That is what BYU's wide receiver core has got to show. And with their top two guys in Chase Roberts and Darius Lassiter out, there's a whole lot of opportunity for the rest of the wide receiver core to stake claim that, hey, I'm him. I've got next. That's what you want to see from this group as they move forward. And should be a very, very entertaining spring because I, for one, am looking forward to seeing how they all perform out there on the field. All right, that is going to do it for this Monday edition of the show. Once again, I hope you had a fantastic weekend. If you wouldn't mind doing so, please subscribe, rate, and review. If you're watching this on YouTube, a lot of you guys, probably your first timers, there's a little bell notification icon. There's a subscribe button. Hit that, enable notifications so you know when a new episode drops and you can be with us every single day because we got daily coverage of the Cougars coming up. So if you want insight on BYU basketball heading into the stretch run here ahead of the Big 12 tournament and March Madness, we got that. We'll also have BYU football and spring camp covered from top to bottom as well and everything in between. So as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Appreciate all of your guys' patronage. And once again, as always, thank you for being everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.